Rob again here. I'm going to walk you through a brief history of the Zero in general. Okay, going to start back with its development. Back in 1937, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a requirement to their aviation industry for a new follow-on carrier-based fighter. It was called the Prototype 12, which was related to 1937 being the 12th year of the reign of the current emperor. So those requirements at the time were extremely stringent and very difficult for the aviation industry to meet. And here are some of the big ones there. It had to have a speed of greater than 300 miles an hour at about 12,000 feet. A very long range for a single seat carrier-based fighter. It was supposed to have the maneuverability and firepower to be an escort fighter and an interceptor. This next one is real important for what you'll see in our airplane, is it needed to have a wingspan less than 39 feet. So it could sit or fit onto the aircraft carrier's elevators to go up and down in between the flight deck and the hangar deck. Okay, it needed to have direction finding equipment. That's what the Japanese were expecting to use over the expanse of the Pacific as they were planning the next years. And it needed to have the dogfight performance and range that they were starting to learn from their war with the Chinese. It's very interesting that the two main military aircraft producers at the time were Mitsubishi and Nakajima. And Nakajima withdrew from the competition to build this because their engineers said, we can't build that airplane. So they withdrew and left it to Mitsubishi. So what did Mitsubishi come up with? Whoops, let me do it. If I back up, that's a picture of the predecessor of the Zero. That's the claw. Some things to notice on that. That's still got an open cockpit, and it's got fixed landing gear. It also notes that back there before the Zero, the Japanese were still using or had radial engine technology and had radial engines on their airplane. So this is what the engineers at Mitsubishi came up with. There's a photo right there that kind of shows it. It's a low-wing monoplane. The predecessor was a monoplane, but there were still a lot of biplanes, not only in aviation, but in militaries throughout the world. It had a very low wing loading. The wing loading, without getting too technical, is basically how much does the aircraft weigh versus how much wing is there to support that aircraft's weight. And the less weight you have on any unit of wing is called a lower wing loading, and that generally gives you a low stalling speed, which means a low fighting speed, and usually also great maneuverability. As you can see, it has an enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear. The fuselage and wing were constructed in one piece. One of the main reasons they did that was to meet those very stringent requirements, they had to keep the weight of the aircraft very, very low. So a lot of their design specifications were to drive the weight of the aircraft down or keep it down. And we'll come back to that. The single piece there allowed them to do that, but it also made it more difficult to produce. So they couldn't really mass produce these things in any kind of way equivalent to the way the United States ended up producing airplanes. You can't see it to the visual eye, but at the very edge of the wings, the wingtip goes forward. And what that does is it allows the wingtips, which are generally the first part of the wing, to stall, and that stalling is the wing is no longer producing enough lift to keep the weight of the airplane up. It twisted forward, and that allowed the wingtips, again, which generally stall first, to stall later. That again drove that stall speed down, and with a slower stall speed, you had a fast or a slower fighting speed as well. It had heavy firepower, 7.7 millimeter, that's about a .30 caliber. It had 2 of those up in the nose, but it had one each in each wing, 20 millimeter. That's about an 80 caliber. That's very heavy firepower, especially at the beginning of the war. It was flush riveted to help smooth and keep it nice and aerodynamic. Lightweight, I mentioned that it weighed, combat weight was only about 5,300 pounds, which is less than half of the later airplanes that the Americans built. As an example, the Hellcat behind us there, its combat weight was over 12,000 pounds, so that's more than double. It's made of this very strong and light duralumin, which was at the time a top secret production thing. They helped develop lightning holes. If you can imagine a piece of aluminum like inside a wing, well, if you cut holes in it, you can reduce the weight without reducing the strength. But back to the some of the weight and some of the design things that hurt. To keep that weight down, they didn't put any armor to protect the pilot or some of the critical parts of the airplane, and it didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks. It also only carried about 60 rounds of ammunition for the cannons, the 20 millimeter cannons, and 500 for the machine guns up in the nose. That's not a lot of ordnance. And in a dogfight, you're going to go through that very quickly. So just some mnemonics and some key dates here, so you know how these things are called. So an A6M3 Type 0. The A stood for carrier-based fighter. The 6 was for the 6th carrier-based fighter in their series. So this was the A6. Remember the photo of the Claude? That was the A5. That was the predecessor. The M designated it was made by Mitsubishi. And the 3 was the specific version of that airplane as they made advancements to it. So it obviously started with A6M1. Its first flight was in April of 1939, and it was accepted by the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1940. That also was the Japanese imperial year of 2600. So you take the last 2 digits, and that's where it got the name, the Type 0, and we started calling it the Zero Fighter. A couple photographs there. The top one, supposedly one of the aircraft taken off from the Akagi during the Pearl Harbor attack. Okay, there's a repeat. The aircraft was accepted by the Navy in July of 1940. It immediately went to China to go fight in that war there. Its first victories came from an A6M2, so that was the second version, and those were over Russian-built I-15s and I-16s. It should be noted that I-15 is a biplane, so they were fighting biplanes initially. A photo there, supposedly, of Zeros over China. The Zero was fairly revolutionary at that time, so they dominated the skies. The performance of that airplane vastly was superior to any other military fighters at the time, so they were dominant. They racked up about a 12-to-1 kill ratio up until about the mid-1942 time frame, and that's when the fortunes of the Zero started to change. We, the Americans primarily, but also the Allies in general, learned how to fight the airplane. They learned that you didn't turn with it. Turning kind of having 2 different categories. It's how fast the aircraft can change its bank angle, i.e. a roll rate, and then it's also how tight a turn radius, how tightly it can turn, and turn rate is how fast can it go around that turn radius. And all the way through the end of the war, none of the Allied airplanes could turn with this airplane. We learned that. We had improved tactics. A naval aviator called Thatch came up with a Thatch weave, where we fought together and we weaved, and by doing this weave, we could get an airplane to shoot ordnance at a Zero fairly quickly. There were also some losses. The Japanese had built up a great deal of experience, and they were highly skilled, they were highly aggressive. Well, they started losing some folks. The Battle of the Coral Sea, there was Midway in June, And then in August of 42, we landed in the Solomons there at Guadalcanal. And so now there are starting to be losses. Remember the single piece of fuselage and the inner part of the wing? It was harder for them to produce these airplanes and replace their combat losses. Anyone care to guess what this bottom photo is? No, you can't say. Okay, we'll get the young man. Yeah, Chris. That's right, the Akutan or Akutan Zero. That's the zero during the June. We're very familiar with June 42 was the Battle of Midway. Well, there was also the battle up in the Aleutians. One of the aircraft went down, was shot down. Normally the Japanese flew their Zeros in a 3-ship. Well, the other two guys, based on what looked like a fairly benign crash, thought that their comrades would still be alive, would have survived that. So they did not strafe it to destroy it. So the airplane stood in that marsh on one of the islands in the Aleutians. We found it, we crated it up, and we sent it to Navy North Island in San Diego, and we exploited it. We got it back into flying condition. We threw Navy test pilots in it, and we rang it through the ringers, and we learned firsthand what it did really, really well, and also what it didn't do so well. And as you can imagine, that word got to the fleet immediately. So all these things started to add up, so that starting in about mid part of 1942, the Allies were starting to learn how to fight this thing. By mid-43, it's less effective, the Zero, against the newer enemy fighters. So by this time, we almost have the Hellcat making the scene, but we've got the Corsair is now fighting in increasing numbers. The P-38 Lightning is starting to fight to show up in theater in increasing numbers. And against those newer Allied airplanes, the Zero was less effective. Some of the inherent design weaknesses: no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, very light. So when we started hitting this thing with our 50 cals, some of those design weaknesses were made very apparent. They had a failure to develop more powerful engines. I have another slide here which will emphasize that. Just of note, September 6th of 43 was the first encounter between a Zero and an F-6F Hellcat. By 1944, the Zero is outdated by new American and Allied airplanes. Design delays, production difficulties in the homeland there, and by mid-44, what's happening to the Japanese homeland? It's starting to get bombed regularly, so it's more difficult for them to replace and produce these newer aircraft. So the Zero, the outdated airplane, has to stay on the front lines. Kind of highly or emphatically illustrated there in June of 44 during the Marianas turkey shoot, where the Zero kind of as an airplane pretty much ended its ability to really terrorize the skies as it had done earlier. And then in the final year to year and a half of the war, they rolled the Zero into the kamikaze role. Okay. To illustrate a little bit of the development of it, we talk about the model numbers. Well, those are illustrated. The first one is the airframe, so any major changes they make to the airframe is changed by the first digit. The second digit is the engine. So here's the first one in 39 is the A6M. A quick recap: A means carrier-based fighter. 6 is the 6th in the series of carrier-based fighters. M is Mitsubishi, stand for Mitsubishi, and the 1 is the first major version of this airplane. The Model 11, so 1 and 1 airframe engine. That was the prototype. The first airplanes had 2-bladed wooden propellers. They had some vibration issues in it, so that's when they went to the 3-bladed metal propeller. Of note, prior to the war, the Japanese had license-built agreements with McDonnell Douglas to build the DC-3, Pratt & Whitney to build the R1830 engine, and Hamilton Standard to build the 3-bladed metal prop. And I was told this little factoid by a source that I believe that all through the war, the Japanese continued to pay royalties to Hamilton Standard for the props that they were making. Again, they solved the problem with the vibration by putting a 3-bladed prop on there. They also, for the last prototype, put a larger engine on it. They were initially flying with a Mitsubishi engine. Nakajima also had an engine, which some folks say was reverse engineered from that Pratt & Whitney. I did get yelled at by an engineer one time at one air show who said, "Nah, nobody reverse engineers. There's a common thread of capability in different things, so it's not that they reverse engineered it. They just used the techniques of the day." Okay, so the first major production change, they went to the A6M2, that's the model 21. So they changed the airframe. They kept that original Nakajima engine, but they changed the airframe. That first production model. Remember we talked about 39-foot wingspan? Well, this first production model was just over 39 feet on the wingspan. That was a big oops. So what did they do? They put folding wingtips on it. There's that first engine, the original Nakajima that went in production. That was producing about 940 horsepower. And that was the model of the Zero that would have flown during Pearl Harbor. It would have flown during Midway and would have been a predominant airplane or predominant model. Not the only one, but the predominant one when we started to go into the Solomons and started our more offensive campaign. Okay, from there they went to the Model 32, the A6M3, that was in 1941. So the 3, the change from the 2 to the 3, that's an airframe change. They wanted to get a higher speed out of the airplane. So the longer wing gave them that real low wing loading. So they could really fight slow, they could really maneuver well, but it kind of limited their dive speed. And fighting these newer airplanes, they wanted to go faster. So they clipped the wings on it, which did what to the wing loading? Increased the wing loading. So now it doesn't maneuver quite as well, it stalls at a higher speed. They also put a new engine on it. This same Nakajima company had built a new engine. It had 1130 horsepower. Remember from one of my earlier slides, the failure of the Japanese to build continually higher horsepower engines would come back to bite them. That's about a 20% increase in horsepower. If you look at the difference between the F4F Wildcat and the F6F Hellcat, that was almost a 70% increase in horsepower. Fairly significant. Okay, but the pilots revolted on this thing. The pilots revolted. They clipped the wing so it wasn't as maneuverable. To put this bigger engine on it, they lost some fuel in between the engine and the cockpit, so it couldn't go as far, or if it went as far, it didn't have the legs to then fight and then get back. So the pilots revolted and said, "We don't like this airplane." So they, in essence, went backwards. And they went back to the Model 22, so they changed the airframe and they went back to this airframe. So they went back to the longer wing with the folding wingtips so that they could get that maneuverability back. And then they put the fuel tanks in the outer wings to get the range back that they had lost with the larger engine, because a pilot's a pilot. You give him an engine with more horsepower and he doesn't want to go backwards. So they kept, as you see, the larger Sakai 21 engine. That was the airplane or the model that would have been starting to reach the fleet in numbers about the times that the Solomons campaign was happening. The A6M4 is kind of the mystery model. Mitsubishi has no records of theirs that show that they produced an A6M4 Model 41 or 42. You can see some information about that in the Naval Air Technical Institute. They were messing with turbo supercharged engines. So they were looking at trying to put some kind of turbo supercharge in there. They couldn't make it work. They couldn't get the metal and the alloys properly to withstand the heat, so it didn't go anywhere. Then the final version, which was the most produced of all the versions, is the A6M5, the Model 52. So the model, the first number, again, airframe, Model 5. They went back by this time. In 43, they're fighting the Corsair, they're fighting the Lightning, they're starting to fight the Hellcat, and having that great maneuverability is not as important now as being able to go faster. So they accept the shorter, rounded wingtips to improve their dive speed. They kept that Model 21, and then there are numerous subversions of this model where they were changing their armament. They're finding that the 7.7 millimeter against a Hellcat with the armor that it had was not knocking it down. So they were changing their armor. Okay, the Model 22 A6M3 is the one that we have right here. So that's the one. A quick reminder here, they kind of revolted. They went back to the longer wings with the folding wingtips to give the pilots back the maneuverability. They put the fuel tanks in the outer part of the wings to get the range back that they needed. Here are the specifications, and this is for the Model 22. About 30 feet long. There's that wingspan, just over 39 feet. Obviously, the engineers determined that they wanted to have that longer wing when they initially designed it so that they could get the maneuverability that they felt they needed. Low weight, max speed, 350 miles an hour. By 43, and to the end of the war, that's slow. That is slow. Still had a phenomenal range. That was one of the compounding reasons early in the war why we didn't think the Japanese could build an aircraft like this, was the great range where it could fly a great distance, fight, and then get all the way back home. We talked about the armament. Again, those 20 millimeter cannons was very, very heavy firepower at the beginning of the war. And based on which book you look at or website, about 11,000 of them were built. Some photos from the late 1990s, which is not all that long ago. Some relics still exist out there in the South Pacific Islands. And that's going to be a segue between my discussion here. I'm now going to hand it over to Ricky, who's going to talk about our airplane.